Dear listeners, do you think you have mastered your demo environment? If not, I would really recommend to listen to our today's episode.
My name is Tim.
I'm Jan. Together we are Sales Excellence.
And this is your podcast for software B2B sales and pre-sales.
We believe in a strategic, value-based and customer-centric sales approach.
With our knowledge and experience, we would like to help you find new inspiration and more success in your daily sales lives. And with that being said, dear listeners, welcome to a new episode of the Sales Excellence podcast. Jan, I don't think we have any housekeeping items today, do we? Or do you have anything on your mind you would like to share before we go into the problem statement with our listeners? No housekeeping items. Okay, then let's go right into the topic. So there's a certain wording, and by the way, we do have a guest today, and I will introduce him just now. But there was a wording that he used in our preparation for this conversation, and he said, okay, what is one of our main tasks working in pre-sales or sales, in fact, right? It doesn't really matter in that regard. And it is, how do we suspend disbelief, right? And that, for me, that was the first time hearing that sort of wording. I mean, we often talk about, okay, how we can sort of instill the trust and the rapport that people that we're trying to sell to believe that the solution can work in the ways they expect them to. So that's the one question. And the second one is really, what does my customer need in order to make a decision, right? Most cases that will actually result into a demo, and that's why I'm quite happy. I think there were a couple of episodes that we've had in the last few weeks and months where we sort of went outside the realm of pre-sales. I think this episode is very much focused on pre-sales again, and therefore we have invited a guest. So today's guest is Peter Cohan, and Peter has actually started his career in the 80s working as a chemist, which I found personally quite interesting, and we can go into that one just now. And then he progressed his career to work in tech, basically occupying various positions in senior management, business development, sales, and marketing for about 20 years. And then in 2003, he founded the Great Demo company to address the challenge of bringing a method for consistent success to the process of creating and delivering software demonstrations. And with that being said, welcome to the show, Peter. Glad to have you.
It is a pleasure to be with you, gentlemen, today. Good morning and good evening.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for joining. And if you don't mind, I would like to start with two somewhat personal questions before we go right into the thick of it. And the first one would be, which I just stumbled upon, actually. I know that you call your consulting coaching company Great Demo, but there's also a second wording to it, which is the second derivative. And I have to be honest, I mean, I'm not an English native speaker. I had to Google it. I had to check it out. And it's actually a mathematical term. And I would love to understand what is the meaning behind this in that context.
So if you remember your math, and most of us don't, the first derivative of motion is velocity, and the second derivative of motion is acceleration. Well, when I founded this business, everybody in the vertical that I was working in, which was pharmaceutical research, was talking about accelerating research, accelerating development, accelerating this and accelerating that. And so I thought it would be very, very clever to actually name my company the second derivative. In other words, it is acceleration. The sad thing is, if you ever try to spell that for somebody, buxtebeeren Sie bitte, you would find that it takes forever to go through SECOND, etc. Worst decision I ever made on naming the business.
Well, I'm just happy that as a non-English speaker, just again to emphasize that I can even pronounce it hopefully correctly. Okay, but that clarifies it. It's all about acceleration, you say. All right, fair enough. And so maybe we can come to the point that I already sort of teased in your introduction. You worked as a chemist before, and then, well, clearly you're now in software tech, and you have been there for quite a number of years. But how did that transition come to place? Like, what does chemistry have to do with software tech?
Well, everything and nothing. So in fact, going into university, I was nearly a double major. It was chemistry, biochemistry, but then with a strong emphasis in computer science. And so, believe it or not, don't laugh when I say this, but I was programming using punch cards on a Burroughs B67 two-processor computer.
Right.
In my university era. And so there's a lot of chemistry both ways. And in fact, We could talk about the chemistry lab experience side of things. The only thing I would mention on that is that I believe I'm the first person to successfully freeze-dry beer.
Is that useful?
If you have ever been backpacking and you've been at 3,000 meters, or for the Americans, something like 9,500 feet, and you suddenly realize that you would really like to have a beer, and you don't want to carry cans or bottles of beer with you, well, freeze-dried beer is quite an interesting idea.
Fair enough. That is a cool story. All right, and with that being said, I would say, if both of you don't mind, let's go into the thick of it. And we really attempted to sort of structure today's episode in 3 parts, right? There's 3 main headings. Well, the first one being presenter terminology, the second one is demo environment data, and then the third one is the personal setup. So that's what we really mean by the perfect demo environment. And I would suggest let's jump into the first one, where you say, okay, dear pre-sales people, or dear salespeople, in fact, right? Sometimes salespeople also demo. In fact, don't call it demo. And if you could guide us through the underlying psychology of that one, please.
Absolutely. So it's imbued in what you started with, and that's the idea of suspending disbelief. So one of our objectives in a demo is to convince the customer that what they're looking at is the real and live environment, and it is as close to the environment that they would actually be using if they choose to purchase and implement the software. So anything we do that makes that less real is hurting our cause. So hence, we want to suspend disbelief as much as possible. And the very nature of the word demo, well, Tim and Jan, when you hear the word demo, what do you think? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, not real.
It's not real. It's fake. Real. And so every time we use the phrase demo or the word demo, it is telling the audience subconsciously or unconsciously that what we're showing them is not real. And I just find it fascinating that you'll see a corporate overview presentation, and then they'll have a big slide that says, you guys tell me,
demo.
And that tells the audience that what we're about to see is not real, even if it is the live software. So that's a small thing, but interestingly, you'll find the word demo appears many, many times in many folks' demo environments. So, for example, you'll see it on URLs. You'll see it all through forms and alerts and on and on. And every time you see that word demo, or test for that matter, what you're really telling the customer is this is not a real environment, and it gently forces them to feel that they need a higher level of proof, such as what?
I suppose that it can work in an actual production environment.
Right. Well, let's put it this way. One of our objectives in sales and pre-sales is to secure the business with the least expensive form of proof. So the least expensive form of proof is either a self-reference or a reference call made by a customer to another customer. The classic case of, I understand you're using X. Do you like it? Would you buy it again? And if the answers to those questions are yes, it's quite likely that the customer who's thinking about the purchase will move forward. The next level of proof is a demo, a lightweight demo, followed by a deeper demo. But if a demo is insufficient, then the expense begins to mount, and the investment on the part of both the vendor and the customer increase as people look at doing a POC or even something like a pilot. So the idea of suspending disbelief and making it look as real as possible is not just a tip, it's actually a strategy to secure the order with the least expensive form of proof.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that. And I think Jan and myself, we also often philosophize around how many demos does it really take, right? The answer is, well, as little as possible and as much as needed to sort of, well, as you put it, suspend the disbelief. And in some cases, that could be zero, right?
That's right.
If the customer is already trusting and has great references available to him to call and speak to, why not even zero? But maybe as a practical question, so you say don't call it demo. And I have an idea of what I call it. And funny enough, for me, this is obviously not entirely new, because the whole idea for this episode came from a newsletter that you have sent out a couple of weeks ago, where you talk about these points. And I've sort of adapted now, because I used to call it demo, to be very frank, just up until recently. I've now adapted the wording to say live software, which is a term you just used. Is that what your suggestion would be, or do you have anything else that could be working?
Well, it's exactly that. It's try to avoid the word demo, even though we've organized a demo meeting and the customer says, terrific, let's take a look at your demo. On the vendor side, try to make it appear as it is, as real as possible. That is really the moral of that. So let's take a look at the live software. Let's see it in action. Those are simple phrases one can use instead of, now let's take a look at the demo.
Yeah, fair enough. Jan, any comments from your side before we move on?
Oh, you already asked everything I was going to ask. So
I can read your mind.
That's for sure. It's true love between Tim and myself.
So how long have the two of you been married?
Let's not go there.
Okay. Moving forward.
So when we stick to the first pillar, so we are still within the presenter terminology. Okay, don't call it demo, check mark set, I would say. The other one that you mentioned is like file names and actual examples of, I suppose, like business processes. So what are some of the worst examples you've seen and what do you suggest instead?
Well, the worst examples are things that are obviously fake. And this actually goes to a little bit of the next topic as well. But anytime you're using file names that are obviously fake, if you use demo or test or example, it's pretty clear that these are not real. What I like to do when I'm doing a demo with a customer is I'll ask the customer, what would you like to name this file, for example? And doing so actually has several advantages. Number one, you're avoiding the use of demo or test or something that you know is not going to resonate. Number two, and much more importantly, you're actually engaging the customer. They have to think briefly as they decide what do they want to call this file name or what do they want to call this report. And they begin to take a little bit of personal ownership of the outcome of this exploration of the live software. So that's a terrific way to solve that problem.
That's a good perspective. I mean, we also often talk about how to keep the audience engaged, right? And even if it's just a simple question like that, not only do they now have to engage because they have to answer the question, but I like the buying in piece because they have now provided a little friction of that overall live demonstration that you're giving by supplying a name for a file or whatever it is. Huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so I think the last one, which we can talk about, is the alignment of words. So I mean, I like to call it terminology, right? So maybe you can guide us what you mean by that.
Tell you what, can you give an example of where there might be a problem? Really putting him on the spot here.
Yeah,
Jan,
you are.
Feel free to jump in.
I like seeing Tim being on the spot.
I mean, now I have to sort of go into the actual operational work that I do. I mean, we talk about sales compensation management, and here we talk often about certain KPIs, right? Salespeople have KPIs, and of course we have demo environments available that have standard KPIs set, which are more often than not, of course, not those KPIs that the customer can identify with because they have totally different KPIs. They work in a different industry and so on. So understanding how their salespeople are being measured upon, understanding the KPIs and the terms they use is for me an easy one, right? Just taking that and replacing a generic name by their specific KPI example. That's what I do.
And that's a perfect example of what I mean by this, alignment of words. Most demo environments presume a set of vocabulary on the part of a broad range of customers. Part of the job of discovery is to understand the specific vocabulary that this particular customer uses, and then to make those either dynamic translations in the demo, or if possible, to actually rename the KPIs, the fields, or whatsoever. That second thing is generally much harder, and so it's up to whoever's presenting the demo, in most cases, to do the dynamic or active translation. So if you're talking about sales compensation and somebody talks about commission structure, but they don't use the word commission, they use the word overage, that's what you'd need to do. You'd need to make those translations for that customer.
Yeah. And at this point, I really have a nice tool to share something that I've been using for a couple of months now. It's a Google Chrome plugin called Demo Monkey, which is actually developed by a German pre-sales, well, not colleague, but a German pre-sales person who's also joining on the pre-sales collective Slack channel. But Demo Monkey, you can find it on the Chrome browser store. And what you can basically do is you can completely just replace text with other text. So
nice.
When the text says Peter Cohan, you can just say, whenever you find Peter Cohan, say Jan-Erik Jank. And then it says Jan-Erik Jank when you put up the screen. And it works beautifully. I'm even using it sometimes when I have like a prospect demo or whatever, and you go on the website from your prospect and where it says like, okay, this is the value proposition, this is what we do. And sometimes it's quite close to what software does, even if they are working, for example, in logistics or whatever. And you can replace like 2 words, and then it's matching the value proposition of what we are doing. So that always creates like a little burst of attention, and people seem to like it. But it also works for general demo data.
Very nice. I'm going to check it out immediately after our session today.
I'll put it also in the show notes.
And to add to that, listening to you guys, in that case, it's really about preparation, right? So you would need to be able to have a chat with your customer to really understand their wording, or you would need to discover the website, or you would need to know the industry inside out to be able to prepare it that way. And
that's part of discovery, and that's a terrific topic for another podcast.
Yeah, indeed. Discovery is certainly a favorite topic of Jan and myself as well.
Definitely.
All right. So I would say presenter terminology, we have sort of covered all the bases for now. So let's move on to the second pillar, which is really demo environment data. And the first one, and I would love to hear your elaboration on this, and maybe I would like to challenge you a little bit. It's using fake names in your demo environment.
So fake names, and let's give some examples. I have seen demos where the entire database is filled with actors' names, famous actors' names, sports characters, and in some cases, famous news people, which is sort of a weird thing. But they're fun, and that's a plus, but they're fake. And as we said before, anything that is obviously not real is putting you at risk of hurting your cause. And so everything being equal, my recommendation is to have sanitized databases with realistic-looking information, which, by the way, in many cases, you can actually get from your QA or QC departments, as they may be currently using tools that actually have fake but realistic names or addresses and on that they use for their own QC practices. So you can challenge me on it, and I would agree that it's fun, but if your objective is to secure the business, then you may want to rethink that.
Yeah, I would agree on it. And when I was in field pre-sales, and if I had the possibility to do kind of real deep dive discovery, I was also asking for, hey, who are we selling to, right? So if it was about CRM, give me a real customer you are dealing with, because as you said, Peter, I think then they can much better imagine how the CRM would look like in their company. I mean, I agree also with you that fake names could be a lot of fun, especially if you are, for example, interested in, I don't know, Marvel characters like I am, right? So I would enjoy it, but I completely agree it's still fake.
And that's the risk. So that I'd consider that to be a smaller one, but just to bear it in mind. Really, it's where things get to be silly in a database, for example, or an example environment, that people really begin to yell fake and begin to drive for a deeper demo, or they want a POC or some other form of proof.
Yeah, that's fair enough. 2 comments, well, maybe even 3. So first one is, of course, if the customer's providing, let's say, for example, I mean, I said earlier, we talk about sales a lot. So for us, one challenge is, for example, reflecting sales hierarchies, right? So if the customer's providing me with a sales hierarchy example, then I'm just going to use that. Of course, I'm going to use my customer's data to reflect that, and not going to make up any names. So I think we all agree on this one. On the random names, I found several websites are in fact providing the service when you can say, please provide me 10 male names or 10 female names from Germany or from Poland or from the US and so on. So that also exists. I've used that before. It makes your life easier if you want to come up with demo data. And the third one is, so maybe some people don't even like Marvel, so maybe you're actually hurting your cause, maybe in that sense. But I'm also thinking about the sort of limbic factor of it, so that that there is something that I've seen before. It's known, and therefore it changes my attention to whatever's being shown. And I think that is the advantage that I see. And to give you a concrete example of how I used that just recently is we were talking to a Finnish company, and I'm a big Formula One fan. And funny enough, of course, there's 2 Finnish drivers currently driving Formula One. So I used those 2 drivers as representatives for my demo. And at least the people on the call, they caught the humor of it. So they seem to like it. I don't know whether it hurt my cause or not. That remains to be seen. So it was sort of a localized name, but obviously someone that is very well known.
You're making a connection, and that's a good thing. And you use the term limbic. It's really just more about making a connection with people. Example. Again, though, I would do that almost as an offshoot from the data you have in the database or in your example environment. So you could reference and by the way, there's such a lovely pun or two with Finnish drivers, but let it go in Formula One. But my recommendation would be to do that on top of, if you will, or in addition to what you already have in the demo environment. But you touched on something that is very, very important. And speaking as somebody who came out of a North American headquartered company and was banished to Switzerland for 2 years, I learned an interesting and rather surprising lesson for somebody from the U.S. Do either of you know what it is? And I know you do.
Well, I suppose that Swiss German is very different than normal German or whatever.
That was definitely true. Schweizerdeutsch is definitely not Hochdeutsch. But know that when you're trying to sell in non-U.S. regions, if you're trying to sell in Europe, for example, or Asia Pacific, and the database that you're working from is all U.S.-based, it's difficult because the very first thing that people notice is, well, these are all U.S. states and zip codes and telephone numbers. And does that mean that we have to make some changes? Will it even manage country codes? Will it manage the different styles of addresses and telephones and other? Will it even deal with umlauten, for example, diacritical marks? So locality is critical. If you're going to sell in a region, you need to have data that looks like that region's data. So addresses, job titles, cities, even certain cultural attributes might be important depending on the nature of your software and your system. Compensation, actually, that's a great example. There are specific rules outside of the U.S. that many folks in the U.S. are completely unaware of that would need to be administered and tracked in various parts of Europe and Asia Pacific and elsewhere. And if you don't have those kinds of capabilities already embedded in the data sets, then again, you're putting yourself at risk.
Oh. So you're talking about, well, you mentioned basically maps or zip codes, but you're also referring to regulations, right? That's what you meant in the last example, right?
Sure. In the United States right now, we still do not have the rigor of email spam that you do with GDPR.
Important points, yeah.
Sometimes just small things, right? So currency, for example.
Currency.
As well. And Switzerland is a good example, right? So maybe you should use euros in Switzerland.
Exactly, yeah.
They have their own currency. And based on that, also the format of how you would present numbers, right? There's a difference, right? And as you said, if you're looking at US dollars and US formatted numbers, it's not localized enough from my experience to really give them the impression, you are definitely fitting into the market here.
Even simple things like whether or not to use a comma or a decimal point in numbering systems tells you a lot about how the vendor understands the local culture or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. This one you can see a lot.
I was simply going to say, for the Americans in the audience who don't know what I'm talking about, look it up.
Yeah, basically the short version is where Americans use a dot, we use a comma, and the other way around to figure out, well, numbers that are larger than 999.
A decimal, right.
I don't even know how to say it, but maybe I should go back to my mathematics, speaking about the derivations. Very good. Okay. So, but it does not only include localities, right? I think there's another very important point that we need to make here is, and that's really the verticalization, right? Whether you speak to a chemical company, right? Or maybe to someone who works in insurance, surely that should make a difference.
And this is another huge area. This area, I think, is comparatively obvious, and yet the translations still need to be understood, and the specifics need to be understood. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen demos where somebody presented, for example, a manufacturing example to a banking organization. And are you guys familiar with the technology adoption curve?
Yes. I know the hype cycle. Is that the same
hype
thing?
cycle?
Yeah.
I am not sure. The technology adoption curve identifies that there are effectively 4 major sets of adopters. There are technology or early adopters who love everything that's new. There's the early majority who are cautious, but not overly so. There's the late majority who are very cautious and really don't want to change. And then there's the laggards who never change at all. Well, depending on who you're presenting to, you may have more or less latitude with things like fake names and localities and verticalization. So if you're presenting to somebody who's an early majority person and you're showing them banking data and they're a manufacturing organization, they may say, oh, okay, I see it, I get it, it's all right. But if you move further, if you will, to the right on that technology adoption curve and you get more to the center of the majority, and you show banking information to a manufacturing organization, they're going to say, no, this is not us. We need to actually see this with our data, and hence they drive a POC. So verticalization of market, verticalization of region, these are all things that need to be contemplated along with where that customer is on the adoption cycle. So I can give you an example of that. Today, human capital management software, HR software, is a very, very mature marketplace. And if you're trying to replace an existing system that's probably been in place for 10 or 15 years, you really are going to need to nail it. You're going to have accurate information that reflects that customer's environment as detailed as you possibly can to avoid having to go to deeper levels of proof. Does that all resonate?
Yeah, it resonates. And maybe one question in regards to that adoption. Is that an individual mindset or is that a company mindset?
That is a terrific question.
You maybe have like 10 people in the room. And when it came, for example, to mobile phones, right? I adopted mobile phones very late, to be honest. Smartphones. Well, let's say smartphones, right? I had like a Nokia brick for quite some time before I bought my first smartphone. But of course, there were like 2-3 years already in down the line. The iPhone came out and people had it left, right, and center. I was a late adopter in that sense, which is maybe weird because I like tech. But in any case, question to you: is it on a company-wide scale, or is it like, do you have to speak to an individual person and keep that in mind?
And the answer is yes. Companies, no, I'm absolutely serious. Companies have cultures, and individuals, of course, have their own sets of thinkings and specifics. A good example is you can take a very conservative company. They will often have roles that are specific technology scouting roles. So these are people who tend to be early adopters. They love new technologies, and yet they're sitting within an organization that is reluctant to change. They're probably late majority. So yeah, you do need to, this is actually a terrific topic for a discovery conversation, but this is what one of the attributes you need to understand when you're talking to an individual. What is his or her or their bent as far as technology adoption, but then also how well or poorly do they represent the company that they're working with? And I'll give you a second example of that. I'll ask it in the form of a question. How often do you work with a champion who really wants your tool, but that champion is finding it hard to push the tool into the company?
Yeah. How often does that happen?
Yeah, not too often.
Really? I would have said pretty regularly, actually.
I would say pretty regularly. Jan, I think he's being sarcastic.
Guys, now to my champions, it's always crystal clear. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. I mean, yeah, definitely regularly. So I'm completely with you.
What is often happening here is we become enablers of the champion This is a little bit of a challenger sales model element. We become enablers of the champion to sell internally to people that are, let's say, more reluctant to change. That's almost the definition of a champion. It's somebody that gets it and wants to pursue your offering inside their company, and they need help. So the answer to your question is yes. You need to understand both the individual and the corporate culture.
Just further emphasizing the need for proper discovery, I suppose.
Yeah. And maybe just to add one thought here, maybe not only discovery, also research, right? If you trying to start to sell into specific verticals or whatever, and you give maybe demos to your salespeople, you have standard demos also for your pre-sales people. So you should put some thoughts into it to really address that specific vertical or industry because you start using it, right? As Peter said, if you do it the wrong way, I think you will fail right away. But if you do it the right way, I think it can be a very nice enabler into that sales cycle. And maybe it's already enough to convince them because they really feel like, oh, you're understanding our industry and you're the first one doing that.
That can be huge.
All right. Then I suppose let's move on to the last point of having perfect demo environment data.
Actually, before we do that, let's go one step back because we've jumped over a topic that is hugely important. That has to do with the nature of the data, problems, solutions, opportunities, exceptions. And let me tell you two brief stories. The first is when I was president of a business unit right around the turn of the century, a long time ago, and we were buying, we were producing both software and selling it, and hardware systems and selling those systems. And we needed a better way to manage our inventory. We had a lot of very, very specialized, expensive parts. People kept ordering things on an ad hoc basis, and we needed to have something that would control that and avoid buying a whole lot of stuff that we didn't need or related types of things. So we had a vendor come in, an ERP vendor, a series of vendors come in and do demos of their systems. And what we wanted, of course, was some way to see what's going on with the inventory at any particular time. We went through a broad range of workflows of how the system would manage inventory, how you could update it, how you could decrement it, how you could enter new items, remove items, change items. And when we finally got to the point where what we wanted to see was a report of what's currently in inventory now, they said, that report's terrific, we don't have it with us. What do you think happened as a result of that demo?
You got the contract, that's clear.
We did not buy that software. That's very clear. We went with another vendor because they could not support the vision of what that inventory report needed to look like. They basically said, trust us, it's a thing of beauty, but they didn't have it in the system. What's worse was they told us that they had 250 canned reports, none of which was that one, which was actually a fairly typical report, and they said they have a BI tool that enabled us to build any report we are interested in. So that's what they told us, but what they didn't show us was the one report that we really needed. And Jan, going back to your point, they knew that's what we wanted to see going into the demo. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, so not well prepared.
Right. So part of the demo environment needs to have two sets of things. Number one are the typical reports, alerts, dashboards that your consumers are expecting to be able to pull out of the system. And it can't simply be a verbalized list of 650 canned reports or a statement that you can create anything you want. You really need to actually have the actual reports, dashboards, alerts, and so forth ready to go based on your understanding of those customers' situations and their needs. So that's number one. Number two has to do with the nature of the data that's in those reports and dashboards. If you're doing a demo of, let's use the inventory example a little bit further. Let's say we're doing a demo to a customer of an inventory system, and we show in the inventory system that everything is green. Everything's perfect. Everything is exactly the amounts that are needed. There's nothing back-ordered. Everything is a thing of beauty. What's your sense of that kind of a deliverable?
Yeah, it's probably not a realistic scenario, right? Because you will always have warnings, errors, logs of things that didn't go as they were supposed to, as production goes.
Exactly. What's the famous statement? Man plans, God laughs. Something like that.
Right.
In any case, so strong recommendation is to have problems that can be surfaced in your dashboards and reports, opportunities that can be investigated, and exceptions that really need to be taken a look at. So, in other words, you want to make this as realistic as possible. As you just said, it's very rare that an environment, a real-life environment, everything is green, everything is working well. And so you want to have the opportunities, the problems, the exceptions that you can actually review and work on with the customer in these live software, I'm going to put air quotes up, demo environments.
Yeah.
So I wanted to close that off before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's the point I wanted to go into. And the one last thought that I have in regards to this, I mean, and this is also a topic we will hopefully very soon also cover on this podcast. It's the matter of storytelling, right? And how can you tell a compelling story if everything is green, right? Typically, you're assuming one persona, you're jumping in the role of Jeff, and Jeff is the administrator, right? And now Jeff wants to do X, Y, Z. But if there's nothing there to interact with, how can you tell a compelling story that your audience will be able to relate to? So that's just the proven practice, so to say, in that sense.
And that is also known in the U.S. as an epic fail. Absolutely that. So, so when you're looking at your demo environment, think in terms of not just the data needs to look real, but the problems and the challenges need to look real as well. I'll give you a horror story, speaking of stories. I was similar timeline a few years back. I was watching a demo, and it was a regulatory software package. And in the compliance and governance industry, time is of the essence. Time is almost always a very, very important factor. Well, the demo that they showed a problem that had been alerted, something like, are you guys ready? I hope you're sitting down, 3 years in the past. Mm-hmm. And showed the timeline that it had been surfaced, it had been escalated, it had gone to several managers, it had some portions of remediation, but it was never resolved, and it was 3 years old. So now, if you were a customer, you're looking at something that shows that an important compliance rule had not been resolved in 3 years. What would be your impression of that?
No. Yeah. Point absolutely taken. In fact, this also relates back to me in regards to demo data in general, right? Whenever you show something and you show a dashboard, make it reflect the current month or the current year at least. If you're coming with something from 2017, yes, still all the points that you're talking about are going to be valid, but still it has a funny feeling to it if you see a dashboard in 2020 that says 2017. It is just like that. So, and surely the audience will perceive it the same way, relating back to what you say, right? It will appear fake.
Absolutely. Good. Now we can move on.
Yeah, now let's move on. And I think now it's becoming a bit more tactical, I would say, right? Because now we're going into what we've labeled personal setup. And the first one is really a classic. You see it a lot, and it's the screen resolution. Screen resolution. Maybe you can guide us through what you've seen here and what you would recommend in that regard.
So several sets of things in this. So first of all, let's start off with the reality today, and that is everybody or nearly everybody is operating from home offices, presenting presentations and demos over the web, just using Zoom, using WebEx, and whatsoever. And almost 99.9% of all demos start with the following phrase: "Can you see my screen?" After which it's talk and click and talk for the next 20, 40, 60, 80, whatever it is, minutes. So people say, yes, I can see your screen, but what they don't report is, can they actually read the text? Can they actually see that mouse? So here's a classic scenario. You, the presenter, have a large screen monitor that you're working from. Your audience is working on a variety of monitors in their home offices, including laptops. So what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, they will not be able to see. And I've witnessed this firsthand just quite recently.
What happened? Tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, a colleague of mine, we were internally talking and sharing ideas on how to present a particular piece of software, and he has a laptop, of course, and he has a screen, but the screen has extremely high resolution, And I'm looking at a shared screen on my laptop, which has a smaller screen. So basically that is being mapped on my smaller screen and you couldn't read a thing. So I had to ask him to zoom in several times before I could see anything.
And the moral here is really twofold. One is there's a lot of assumptions being made. And number two, there are no checks being done. So the assumptions that are made are things like, well, if you can see my screen, then everything's good, when that's definitely not necessarily true. And the lack of checks is something that I teach, that you've got to have a checklist as you're preparing for these demonstrations. And one simple one is to bring up a typical software screen where you have your smallest font size and then ask the audience, can you read this text? If they can, then you're good to go. If they can't, either you need to verbally communicate what they're seeing, which happens a lot, or you need to do that a lot, or you need to change your screen resolution and then reconfirm that they can actually see it. Along similar lines is your mouse cursor size and whether or not it's filled in. Are you guys Mac or Windows?
So I'm on a Mac.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, and I am as well. And the default mouse cursor on a Mac is just a thin outline with a white insides. And Tim, when you had this experience with your colleague, could you see his mouse clearly and comfortably?
Yeah, no, I know what you're hinting at. And the mouse cursor size, the default size is very tiny.
Very
tiny. In fact, I've increased mine by, I think I at least doubled it or whatever, and I made it black. So
exactly.
I didn't go too fancy like in pink or whatever, but I made it black and I made it larger. And so I hope it's easier to follow than the default settings.
And that's exactly the guidance I was going to offer. Most laptops of presenters, I should say most machines, you would do well by taking your mouse size, go to the... actually, it's interesting to note that on both Windows and Macintosh, increasing your mouse cursor size and changing the color or filling it in is not obvious where you find it. You find it in Access on the Mac. Display has nothing to do with the mouse. And it's similar under Windows. But I recommend increasing the size by about 200%. In other words, make it about twice as large and fill it in. And then check with your customer, can you see my mouse clearly? And a terrific tip that I suggest as a starting point for all web interactions is to take your mouse and move it to the top left-hand corner of your screen and move it just once or twice and ask if your audience sees it. They'll respond, yes, we do, and then move it down to the bottom right corner and ask again, and you're actually accomplishing two objectives with that. Do you know what those are?
Well, my first thought was that you make sure that the boundaries of whatever you're showing are also visible. That was the one thought I had.
So that's idea number one. And idea number two is actually rather subtle. You're gently but firmly training your audience to respond. So you're saying, can you see my mouse up here? Yes? Okay, great. Terrific. Let me move it down here. Can you see it again? Everybody? Yes? Okay, good. So you're teaching them now that we're going to have a call and response as opposed to a fire hose demo.
Yeah, that's something I've picked up on. I mean, even on the webinars that you have done in the past, also for Pre-Sales Collective, I think is the one I've seen where you keep a very high level of engagement throughout whatever you're talking about. That's certainly something, well, I certainly can learn from still because I also tend sometimes to go off the rails at occasions.
Well, this is all part of the practice. You know, people talk about storytelling, and as you noted, that would be a great follow-on podcast. But a story is not a day in the life, for example. Stories are used to illustrate. Stories are used to support. Stories are used to take uninspiring ideas or memes and make them live for centuries and centuries. That's what stories do. That's a topic for another podcast.
Indeed. It sounds very interesting, though, the way you put it just now. And I think we have one last point here in this tactical personal setup, which is really... No, we do not.
I think we also missed one topic where we were talking about resolution and mouse cursors and lovely colors of them, which is actually going to full screen, right? Especially if you present over the web, right? I'm not interested into your Google bookmarks and all that great stuff. I'm interested in your live software, of course. So maybe it sounds like a simple thing, and Peter, please add to it. But putting your presentation to full screen, in my eyes, totally makes sense.
So what Jan is referring to here is if you have a browser-based application and you're displaying your application through that browser, you got to be cognizant. Remember that the audience is seeing your entire screen, and I think I actually did the math that in a typical browser window, I thought it was something like 8% is consumed by the toolbars and the dock at the bottom of your Macintosh. That can all be recovered and when you go into full screen mode. And what's really interesting is the non-obvious, and that is that when you go into full screen mode, if you ask somebody, what do you see as the difference, they say, oh, it doesn't look as complicated. So even though you're not using those tools and those bookmarks and all the rest of that stuff, the mere fact of it being present makes your application look that much more complicated. So full screen mode, Jan, excellent tip. Go into full screen, make sure they can see everything properly, and you also get that extra 8 or 10% screen real estate that otherwise would have been consumed. Excellent tip.
Yeah, and especially Jan should stick to it because I know he always has like 50 tabs open, which makes it look much more complicated because he reboots his computer like once a year or something.
Once a year, there you go.
I mean, it's a Mac, so.
And by the way, a little extra cherry on top, you also hide the URL, which means even if your URL says demo something, which for most demo systems it does, you will not see the URL anymore, and bookmarks and the rest of it. Yeah. And one other comment that I now have I had it earlier in my mind, but then I forgot it. When you were talking about the screen size, that directly relates, right? I would say, most SaaS companies are using the browser to run the application, right? So I would expect that the majority of our listeners are demoing their software in the browser. And you're talking about the resolution. What you can do, of course, in Chrome and all the other browsers is that you just zoom in. So you don't have to change the resolution, but you change the zoom level to 125, 150%, and that already solves the issue then.
That's correct. Practice it ahead of time because very often people are surprised to see what it does to their menu bars and their sliders and so forth. Do we have time for one more important idea?
If it's important, how can I say no?
That's why I prefaced it that way. And Jan raised it, and it has to do with color. I cannot tell you how many times I will see dashboards that have blocks of color or heat maps, for that matter, where red, of course, is bad, yellow is a caution, and green, of course, is good. Well, here's the question. Do any of you, do the two of you guys know how many people in the world, or what percent of the population, is colorblind or color deficient?
I have no idea.
I don't know the exact number, no. I would assume, my assumption would be 17%. 17,
well, that's aggressive. That is not correct, but thank you for playing. We'll send you the home edition of the game. So ask your wives. The female portion of the human population is relatively safe. It's about 0.5% of women suffer some form of color blindness or color deficiency. So that's 1 in 200 women. On the other hand, we, gentlemen, it's about 1 in 12. So 7.5% of the male population is either fully colorblind, meaning not fully, they tend to see tones of brown, or color deficient, which means that in an audience, let's say if you are presenting to a group, I hate to say it this way, of IT folks, and you've got 12 or 15 gentlemen in the room, it's quite likely that 1 or 2 of them is color deficient or colorblind. And you cannot start a web session by saying, tell you what, before we begin, is there anybody here who's colorblind? Oh, you poor person, I'm so sorry to hear that. No, what you do is if you have, Tim's cracking up, if you have something where color is important, you need to call it out. And you'd say, so what you see here in red, as you're circling it with an annotation tool, indicates that you have a problem with blah, blah, blah. What you see over here with orange indicates that it's a caution, you might need to check into it. And right here in green, you can see that everything is good. I'll make the comment that good UI practices, in addition to color, should also offer shapes. So those of the population that have that challenge can deal with these things much more readily, if you will. But that's another check that is well worth doing when you're operating over the web. Don't assume that your audience can see the appropriate colors, or that, in fact, their beamers or projectors or their laptops can actually render the appropriate colors. You just don't know.
Fair enough. Now, I would say it applies to on-site meeting just as well as to remote meetings, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Same thing. So, Jan, do you have anything else, or may I move on to the next point?
No, I'm just glad that I'm getting the home edition of the game.
Yeah, very good.
To improve my assumptions for the future. So
there you go.
Thanks for that.
So the last but not least, for sure, is notifications off. Which I hope both of you have before we went into this conversation.
Absolutely. Although it's not perfect. You do the best job you can. Would you guys like a horror story? I'd love to tell this story.
Of course.
So I'm watching a webinar. This is probably 15 or 16 years ago. I'm watching a webinar from one of the webinar companies. I don't remember which one it was. And there were easily 500 or 600 people on this webinar. And the vendor had just released chat. And they were encouraging everybody to chat to the presenters, chat to one another, chat back and forth. And about 20 minutes into the webinar, appearing in that bottom right corner of the screen, in that Outlook preview message, appeared long enough and robustly enough, and I don't remember if it was a boyfriend sending a message to a girlfriend or vice versa, but the preview message described in rather erotic detail plans for a date that evening. And I can share with you that audience attention went up, but it was not at all what the presenter had desired. And that webinar was over at that point. Everybody really used chat. They're chatting. Did you see that? Oh, those guys are so lucky. It was hilarious, but very sad. So what's the moral of the story? Turn everything off. Sanitize your environment. If you're using back channels like Slack, make sure they really are back channels. So that things don't bleed through. That's just a simple checklist best practice. But it was so funny to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, popping up emails, you see that a lot, especially like with the Outlook. I mean, the first thing I did when I had to use Outlook, I disabled those pop-ups. So that doesn't happen anymore. But what was also quite nice, what I found, at least on the Mac, when you open up that sidebar, you can scroll up and turn notifications off per se for everything, for every application. And the nice thing, it turns it back self on the next day, which is good because typically you don't remember to turn it on again. But the Mac does that, which is nice. And I would say that also extends to phones, right? I mean, when you are in a meeting, turn your phone to flight mode, don't disturb mode or whatever, so you can really concentrate.
Would you like one final horror story on that same topic? It's just so much fun. This was same era when I was leading this Discovery Tools organization. We had brought a vendor in. I'm not going to tell the name of the vendor, to do a demo, and the salesperson brought his SE in, and it was a classic sales guy who flogged us with a 10 or 15 minute corporate overview presentation until we gently asked him to stop. And then he said, all right, I'm going to turn things over to my SC, to my technical expert, that was his phrase, who's going to go ahead and do a demo. He retreated to the back of the room, and this was during the BlackBerry era. So he was in the back of the room thumbing away on his BlackBerry, which I happened to notice. And the demo began and proceeded for a while. And we began to ask some questions. And one of the guys on my team, asked a question which admittedly wasn't the sharpest nail in the bin. It wasn't the smartest question, but it was well-meaning and well-intended. And I happened to note the salesperson look up sharply and sort of scowl at my guy who asked the question, and he starts tapping away at his BlackBerry, and a moment later, appearing in the Outlook preview window, or an SMS window, was a message that said, "Pay no attention to that guy. He's an idiot."
Yeah, that is a horror story.
End of demo. End of sales cycle. So the moral's pretty clear. Turn off your notifications.
Jeez. Okay. Wow. Yeah, that makes it quite tangible. And I mean, at this point, I think we have given quite a few tactical but also strategic tips here across the presented terminology, demo environment, data, personal setup. So I don't know, Jan, would you like to do us the honors?
To sum it up, yeah. So real-time conclusion as
our new feature on the podcast, RTC.
Yeah, the RTC stuff at the end. So with my words, right, if you present live software, make it real, right? Not fake, not just a demo. Make it real stuff. And find the least expensive proof to sell to your customer, as Peter said. Ideally, you wouldn't do a single demo because you could already convince your customer by calling a reference of your company. But if you move further, make sure you get your stuff right, because if you go into lightweight demos or deeper dive demos, and if they would be insufficient in respect of delivery or in respect of your demo environment, it could go crazy and it could go pretty expensive if we think about POCs and all that stuff. Use discovery to also find out what would the right naming be, right, for your data, the general wording of your customer, of his industry, all that stuff, as well as your file names. Localize and verticalize your demo, I would say all the time, to really increase the chance of convincing your customer as early as possible, and to also show them that you really understood what they are aiming for. Illustrate the reality in respect of challenges and problems, as well as use cases, because in reality, not everything is green on your dashboard or on your report or within your opportunity. So make it real. Get your personal setup right and check with your audience, right? If everything is to their favor. Like you said, Peter, are you able to read the text or not? Are you able to see my mouse pointer and these things? And the final conclusion from my side is basically, so simple things can really make a huge difference to your audience and to the whole success of your sales cycle.
Peter, would you say that was a fair summary?
I think that was a terrific summary. Well done.
That is, by the way, another thing I discovered today. One of your favorite words is terrific.
It is. I don't know why. It's just a terrific word. What could I say?
Indeed. And so maybe we can conclude here then. Thank you very much, Jan, for that RTC. Much appreciated. Peter, if our listeners really liked what they heard here from you and would like to explore more from Great Demo, where can they go? Where can they educate themselves and maybe reach out?
Well, thank you very much for that. GreatDemo.com would be the website. It has information on Great Demo, the methodology, and probably more importantly for the listening population, if you go to the resources page, there are 70-some-odd articles, including a perfect demo environment, which was a topic for this, that has some other information that we were unable to cover today. And of course, then there's lots of other articles, and there's our blog on the blog page. So greatdemo.com.
Yeah, and maybe one personal recommendation. I've personally subscribed to your newsletter. You didn't mention that just now. I love the newsletter. I actually have been sending a couple of ones to colleagues of mine, and it always resonates. So I love that one. So another tip from my side to subscribe to that.
Thank you.
So with that, all right. Dear listeners, if you stayed until here, which of course we hope you did, and if you did, you potentially liked what you heard. So we would really appreciate if you would give us a positive rating on Apple Podcasts and iTunes, and potentially follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, very much, I mean, since we don't use this format here to market anything of ours, there's no products, there's no solutions, there's no coaching, there's nothing. We're just doing this really for the fun of it and to share our experiences. So if you leave a comment on LinkedIn or any sort of feedback for us, we really appreciate that. That is our salary, so to say, if you want to put it like that, for doing this podcast. And I don't know, maybe Jan, closing words to you?
No, just want to say a huge thank you to Peter. It was a lot of fun, a lot of lessons learned again. So thanks for that.
Wow, the pleasure was mine, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.